Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 500 library systems across the US, Canada, and New Zealand with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator, in conversation with each of the authors and presenters that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, we are so honored to have Smithsonian scientist Dr. Jay Falk with us to talk about their research and how it relates to the Bird Book, the stories, science, and history of birds. Hi, Jay.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to get started. Before we jump in, I want to give everybody the standard housekeeping information that keeps everything running smoothly, and then I will turn things over to you.
Sounds good.
We have compiled some questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but we, of course, welcome all viewers to submit questions during the presentation by clicking the questions button. There are quite a few of you tuning in today, and we will take as many questions as we can during the Q&A period that's reserved for the end of the hour. As a reminder, there will be a link to the recording sent out to all registrants in about 24 hours. So if you have to leave early for any reason, just look for that in your email. Now to formally introduce our guest for today. Dr. Jay Jensine Falk is a postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute and the University of Colorado. He is an evolutionary biologist and behavioral ecologist fascinated by the diversity that can be found within species, especially in sexual traits. During his PhD, he began studying white-necked Jacobin hummingbirds as an STRI short-term fellow, and later as a Smithsonian pre-doctoral fellow. His findings that some females of this species look like males while others do not has become the cornerstone of his research program. He's inspired by the dizzying array of feather coloration that can be found in hummingbirds. After completing his PhD at Cornell University, he moved to the University of Washington to study hummingbird movement and metabolism. Now at the University of Colorado, he is investigating the genetics and development of feather coloration. Jay lives in Gamboa, Panama, where he studies the hummingbirds that visit the feeders at his house on the edge of the forest. Again, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to turn things over to you now.
Great. Thank you so much, Brandon. And thank you all for being here. And thanks to the Library Speakers Consortium for inviting me to talk about this beautiful bird book and to talk about some of my research and how it sort of relates to what's in this book as well. Now, before I jump in, I'd like to ask you all a question that I think about often. That is, why do we pay attention to birds? You can interpret this question any way you'd like. What do birds mean to you personally? Or why do we as humans pay attention to birds? What is it about them? But also, what is it about us that makes us want to pay attention to them? I'll let you think about this while I play a short video to add just a bit of fodder for your thoughts. The video is about 1 minute, and I think that the sound might not be working, just to let you know, but I'll keep quiet so that you can watch. Okay, so that was two magnificent rifle birds, a type of bird of paradise, one male and one female in a courtship interaction. And it's one of my all-time favorite videos of bird behavior. So for me, some of the things that come to mind while I watch this. First, birds are undeniably beautiful creatures. Sometimes they have feathers that can be either brilliantly colorful or elegantly restrained. Other times, the only way to describe a bird is cute and goofy looking. Birds make sounds that grab our attention, that can be sometimes jarring, sometimes melodious and resonant. And birds don't do these things for humans, usually, but the sensory systems that birds relative to other organisms overlaps a lot with the sensory systems of humans. So when birds communicate with each other through color and sound, humans also get to tune in. Birds also do incredibly interesting things, and they'll do these fascinating behaviors right out there in the open for us to see. A pair of binoculars can help, but you really don't need any tools at all to watch birds behave. This is not the case for many, many animals. Some of them only live in water. Many are so small that we only get glimpses of them. Some of them are nocturnal, so they're hard to see. In many ways, we're extremely lucky that birds are so easy to observe. Third, birds are everywhere. You can find birds on every continent, as well as the open seas. You can find them in your backyard or outside your apartment window. You can find birds in the Arctic and Antarctic poles, but also in the most densely populated cities. There are very few places on this planet that you will have a hard time finding birds as long as you try. And of course, most birds fly. I think that there's something undeniably magical about flight, and the seeming ease that birds are able to do this really captures the imagination and has probably done so for as long as humans have existed. So these are just some of the many possibilities that you may have thought of. But one of the biggest reasons I think we like to pay attention to birds is that they are so incredibly diverse. From the tiniest hummingbird to the largest ostrich, birds have evolved into over 10,000 species across the world, into a spectacular array of forms and plumage colors that defy our imaginations. Now, to parse all this magnificent diversity, I want to take a moment to talk about how scientists classify birds. And we do this by assigning different species to groups based on how closely related they are evolutionarily. So at the biggest scale, birds are all part of what we call Class A, or the avian class. There are other animal classes, for example, the mammal class, which we humans belong to. The avian class includes all living birds, plus some groups of extinct birds like the moas and terror birds. All birds are the living descendants of dinosaurs, and by some definitions, birds also include these feathered dinosaurs like Archaeopteryx, which were able to fly but retained many features reminiscent of their dinosaur ancestors. We can see in these species a link from the dinosaurs of the past to the birds of modern times. Now, to go deeper into our classification system, let's take a very familiar bird like the American robin, and we'll quickly walk through its classification from very broad to very specific within the avian class. The broadest classification within birds is order, and robins are part of the passerine order, or the perching birds. This is a really huge and important group of birds that include many familiar species you'll find in urban areas, but also more exotic species like that bird of paradise we saw in the video I showed a few minutes ago. At the family level, we're starting to see some solid resemblance to the robin, which belongs to the turdid family or the thrushes, like this eastern bluebird. And at the genus level, we're talking about very closely related species that probably had a common ancestor just in the last several million years. The Turdus genus is sometimes called the true thrushes, and it also includes species like the common blackbird that you might find in Europe. And finally, at the species level, we've reached Colubris, the American robin. Every one of the 10,000 bird species can be classified by this system from order to species. Now, the bird book captures this incredible diversity in a really astounding way. As I'll show you in a moment, this book really gives us the story of the full range of all these strange and wonderful species. The bird book is full of visuals, photos, and illustrations, but it's also packed with information about every bird family, covering natural history, scientific discovery, but also the history of human interaction with each of these types of birds. So just as an example, you can open to any page and you'll find something like this section on hornbills. The bird book is organized by bird family, so each of the many families of birds gets very balanced attention. For every page, you'll learn both general information about the order in which the birds are categorized, all the way down to specifics of natural history and human cultural interactions. For example, here we learn that hornbills are part of the Buceratiformes order, and they're primarily found in Africa and Asia. There are more than 60 species and 2 families. Something very interesting about hornbills is that the females will actually seal themselves inside a tree hole during the nesting period and are completely reliant on the males to bring her and their chicks food. We also learn that in the Naga communities of India and Myanmar, the feathers of the great hornbill are important symbols of loyalty and devotion, and their headdresses with hornbill feathers are worn during important festivals. And we get this depth of knowledge for every family. So as I mentioned before, the passerines or the perching birds is a very important order, and it makes up nearly half of all the bird species, and they live across the globe. For example, tits and chickadees can be found on many parts of North America and Europe, and we learn that they are prodigious collectors of seeds and nuts. A single willow tit can store up to 150,000 items during a single season. And tits that collect food in caches have much larger brains than those that don't. Another example is finches, which are small, mostly seed-eating birds that can be found worldwide except for Antarctica. Finches include the famous canaries, which were used as a warning system for detecting the buildup of toxic gases in underground mines, hence canary in the coal mine. And goldfinches hold religious significance to some Christians, and European goldfinches appear in over 500 religious works of art from the Renaissance period. And we also have a great number of families that are not in the passerine order. These can include more familiar birds like eagles, but also birds that may be more difficult to find without traveling to other parts of the earth. For example, turacos can only be found in Africa. Oddly, the turaco's fourth toe is angled in a way that allows them to be exceptionally agile, moving between tree branches. And turaco feathers are often found in the ceremonial costumes of the forest peoples of Central Africa. A more familiar family, the penguins, is primarily found deep in the southern hemisphere and have given up flight in the air for highly agile and spectacular swimming abilities. They often breed in enormous colonies, sometimes made up of over 1 million breeding pairs. Now, humans have been paying attention to birds for a very long time, and the bird book provides a ton of interesting facts about how humans have interacted with birds, including scientific discovery, but also art and domestication, like with chickens, which were first domesticated in Southeast Asia more than 8,000 years ago. So going back to our classification system, scientists often describe and categorize biodiversity down to the species level. But I want to bring us even further. I'd like us to consider variation within a species. So what are ways in which animals can be different from each other while being part of the same species? Well, one example of this variation is from location to location. For example, If you were to travel to the very southern tip of Baja California in Mexico, you would find the San Lucas American robin, which is a subspecies of the American robin and has a more yellowish belly rather than the typical orange you see in most robins. Another type of within-species diversity is age variation. One of my favorite examples of this is in birds, at least, is the Cinereus mourner. As you can see, the adult and the hatchling look so completely different. The adult is gray and quite drab, while the hatchling is bright orange and very fuzzy. And what scientists think may be happening here is that the hatchlings are mimicking this highly toxic caterpillar that lives in the same region as a way to deter predators. Another type of diversity we see in nature is sexual diversity. Sexes, whether a bird is male or female, can sometimes lead to really spectacular differences within species. And these differences have evolved because of differences in reproductive strategies. Sexes are a fundamental part of biodiversity, but it's important to remember that sexes aren't always so different from each other, and similarity between the sexes is as common as differences. So let's take a family like the beautiful cotingas, and here I'm showing a phylogeny or family tree that shows the interrelatedness between species. And I love this particular figure because it shows both males and females together. And we can see that in some species, like this capuchin bird, females and males look essentially identical. But in others, like the three-wattled bellbird, the difference is remarkable. If you were to find a female and a male separately in the wild, and if you didn't have a field guide, there's no reason you'd believe these were the same species. So yes, sexes can be different, but we can take this even further. What about variation within sexes? Now, to illustrate this, I'm going to tell a story about a single very important bird that lived more than 250 years ago, Lady Tint's extraordinary peahen. Lady Tint lived in the Halswell House in England, which you can still visit today. And at this time, in 1772, it was a very popular hobby for the upper-class English to keep peacocks, which originated from India. And Lady Tint had a flock of these peacocks and peahens that she cared for. Now, these birds, like all other birds, molt and change their feathers every year. For peacocks, you typically don't see much difference from year to year. This is why it really surprised Lady Tint when one year, all of a sudden, one of her favorite peahens molted from this type of plumage, typical for females, to this, the typical plumage of males, including that classic, brilliantly long, beautiful tail. This bird was very well documented. Here's a 1783 illustration of this female labeled a male feathered peahen, which was based on this same peahen and was preserved in a museum following her death. A few years later, in 1790, a scientist and surgeon, John Hunter, wrote a paper titled Account of an Extraordinary Pheasant, which was based on observations of Lady Tint's peahen. This paper has had a quiet but profound legacy to this day for modern biological research. To Hunter, Lady Tint's peahen demonstrated that the body has an ability to produce both male-type and female-type features, and that something physiological can cause the appearance of one versus the other. Second, Hunter was the first to describe different aspects of males versus females as either primary traits like reproductive organs versus secondary traits like plumage coloration or body size. Now, the first of these two concepts was later proven correct through the study of genetics and developmental biology. And the second was deeply important to some of Charles Darwin's most well-known theories, for example, the theory of sexual selection. Despite all this attention to one female peahen, this is actually not that uncommon. If you've spent some time with chickens, you might have noticed that male roosters often grow these hook-like claws on the backs of their legs. These spurs are used during fights where they'll rear up towards each other with their feet first and basically use those spurs to try and stab each other. What's really interesting, though, is that it's not uncommon for some females to grow these types of features as well, and this has been written about extensively through human history. Even Aristotle wrote about these females more than 2,000 years ago. That female chickens may grow in imitation of the males and attempt to tread, and their crest and tail are raised so that one would not easily recognize that they are females. In some, there has even been an outgrowth of a sort of small spurs. In fact, I had the tremendous honor to meet one of these chickens just last year at my partner's childhood home, where her mom keeps chickens for eggs. One of these hens, Sylvie, has grown an extra long spur and long saddle feathers like a male. Here you can see one of them, and on the right you can see how long and sharp these spurs have become. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, this is just a few females here and there. This could never be a common type of variation. But this is where I'll introduce you to the main character of my research, the white-necked Jacobin. This species ranges widely in the lowland tropics of Central and South America, and for the last 10 years, I have been studying this species in Panama as a part of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. Now, if you look up this bird in most field guides, you'll see something that looks like this. Females have a mottled green plumage with a dark tail, while males have bright iridescent or ornamented plumage with a blue head and a white tail. But my research has shown that, in fact, 20% of adult females look nearly identical to the males. And it's this incredible sexual variation that has driven the studies I'll be talking about today. And when I started this work with this species for my PhD, there was really very little known about this bird. I had this small paper from 1950 describing this striking female variation in museum specimens, but no one had verified this in live organisms, and no one had done studies in the field to really understand why this might be happening. My two big overarching questions were, why, from an evolutionary perspective, do some females look like males? And related, why are there two types of females rather than just one? And it's this hummingbird mystery that I have been obsessed with for the last 10 years. So let's take a brief aside here just to talk about hummingbirds, because hummingbirds are truly remarkable. And in many ways, they exist at the extreme end of not only what it means to be a bird, but also what it means to be an animal. They have extremely high metabolic rates. Their hearts can beat over 1,000 times per minute, and they can beat their wings over 100 times per second. And they're also the fastest bird when accounting for body size. Hummingbirds make up the trochilid family, which is made up of over 360 species of hummingbirds. This is a map showing density of species, and this red area shows a very high density. So while North America has around 20 species, Colombia alone has over 165 species. Hummingbirds are extremely colorful, and a recent study found that hummingbirds actually have more colors within their 360 species than the rest of all birds combined. They also have the ability to see even more colors than we can as humans. So for a hummingbird, the colors you see here does not actually show the true extent and diversity of color that they can see in themselves. Now, hummingbirds have captivated humans for a very long time, and they appear frequently in the mythology and religious beliefs of the ancient Mesoamerican civilizations. One of the most important Aztec gods was called Huitzilopochtli, which means hummingbird of the south, and was revered as a god of the sun and of war. The Aztecs clearly viewed hummingbirds as beings with a ferocious will to live that were capable of great physical feats and bravery when fighting against other hummingbirds. This painting is from a classic Mayan vase and depicts part of their creation myth involving a hummingbird on the left side and the earth god on the right with his daughter, the moon. Mayans also believed hummingbirds to be capable of carrying the desires and human thoughts between the living and the dead. So I've had the tremendous opportunity to study hummingbirds through the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama. And I do this work in a town called Gamboa, which is right in the center of Panama along the Panama Canal. You can imagine a hot, humid environment surrounded by rainforest and wildlife. And this is where I currently live and do my research. So now back to the white-necked Jacobin. Just to give you a closer look at the species, on the top row, I have what male white-necked Jacobins look like, and on the bottom is what most females look like. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'll be referring to this color type as drab females. Here, I'm showing the male on the top again, but this time a male-like female on the bottom. So the differences between these female types is dramatic, and the male-like females really are male-like, at least in their plumage. Now, in this video, you can see a female with male-like plumage sitting on a nest. White-necked Jacobins, like all hummingbirds, have female-only parental care. Unlike in many birds, male hummingbirds do not partake in parental care. But we know that male-like female Jacobins are fully capable of reproduction. They build nests, lay eggs, and care for young just like other females. Now, to figure out the answer to my questions, one of the first things we had to learn to do was safely catch these birds. What we use is called a mist net, which are these big rectangular nets made of very fine mesh, which you can just barely see here. The birds, like us, have a hard time seeing them, and they get stuck in them as they try to fly away. Now, for hummingbirds, we have to use a special technique where we place hummingbird feeders between two mist nets, and the back net is open, but the front net stays closed until we see a bird that we'd like to catch. And then we very quickly pull the front net up before they can escape. I'll play a slowed down version of that here. So birds are near the feeders, the net goes up. Here we end up actually catching 3 hummingbirds. So once we have a bird in hand, we can get all sorts of information from them. We can place tiny metal bands on their ankles so we can keep track of them over their lifetimes. We can take photographs and body size measurements, and we can also take a small blood sample that can be used to find the genetic sex of the birds. Now, this is important because unlike with mammals, whether a bird is male or female can be very difficult to tell based on their external genitalia. To date, we've been keeping track of this population in Gamboa for 10 years and processed over 600 individuals. One very simple thing we can do is observe these animals at feeders. This is a view of my backyard, looking out from underneath my house in Gamboa. And you can see several hummingbirds interacting by chasing each other, feeding, and vocalizing. And it's from simply watching these birds that I ended up with one of my first hints as to what was going on. That is that the male plumaged birds tend to be more aggressive than the less ornamented females. This is based off of who tends to chase who. Often, I would find that ornamented male plumaged hummingbirds tended to initiate chases away from feeders much more so than the drab females did. But the problem is, at this point, I can't really tell apart the males from the male-like females. So my next question was, are male-like females as aggressive as males? One way we can think of this is whether or not they have the same competitive ability. But how do we measure competitive ability in hummingbirds? One way is to look at what we call burst power, which is basically hummingbird weightlifting. We measure this by draping a string of weighted beads around the shoulders of the birds, and then allow the bird to try and escape upward toward a light. And then we count how many of the weights the bird is able to lift before it gets pulled back down. This is a proxy for the acceleration ability of a bird, which is a very important metric during in-flight aggression. What we ended up finding from these and other experiments was that males do have higher competitive ability than both male-like females and drab females. But there was no difference between the two female types. This begs the question. The males and the male-like females look similar to each other, but we now know that it's only the males that have the higher competitive ability. So are other hummingbirds able to tell that difference? To answer this question, I did an experiment where I placed two hummingbird feeders next to each other. And on each feeder, I placed a taxidermied hummingbird, either a male, a drab female, or a male-like female. And I would sit and record what happened when hummingbirds would visit. Now, I was particularly watching for incidences of aggression or attacks toward these taxidermy mounts. I wanted to know which mounts would get attacked more or less often. So this is what that looks like in real life. We're looking at two different hummingbird feeders on the left and on the right. And on each, you can see a taxidermied hummingbird here and here. And right here is a live approaching hummingbird that is about to interact with the feeders. And I'll show you what happens next. So there you saw a short peck. And there's even a little yank on some of the feeders on that right side. Now, from this experiment, I ultimately found that drab females get attacked more than males and male-like females, but that they treat males and male-like females the same, indicating that they can't tell the difference based on plumage alone. So here we see that apparently other hummingbirds seem to understand that the colorful male plumage is associated with higher aggression, and they avoid attacks toward them. But they don't seem to distinguish between males and male-like females, even though the male-like females also have less competitive ability. And this leads to my last question, and that's whether all that aggressive attention towards drab females reduces their ability to access nectar, which is an extremely important thing for a hummingbird, which need to feed efficiently and quickly in order to survive. To get at this, we needed a way to monitor hummingbird behavior in the wild. Since hummingbirds are very small and very fast, this is not an easy task. What we ended up doing was implanting these tiny RFID tags between the shoulders of over 150 individual birds. And these tags are smaller than a grain of rice. They last the lifetime of the bird, and the technology is pretty much the same as one of those ID cards that you would use to swipe into a building. We can then monitor bird behavior using these feeders equipped with an antenna. Each time a bird with a tag visits one of these feeders, it logs the time and location and the individual ID of that bird automatically. Now, a single feeder equipped with an antenna can give us some really interesting data. But what we needed was a lot of data. So we ended up putting these feeders all over the town of Gamboa. Overall, over 2 years, we ended up collecting a very nice data set. We got feeding information for 155 individual birds with around 80,000 logged visits in total. Now, using this data, we can make a map of the daily life of a hummingbird based on which sites it visits. So in this map, we can see all the available RFID feeders in Gamboa in these gray dots, and each line is showing movement from one location to another, which is the color of the lines representing, and the color of the lines represents the time of day. The numbers at each feeder show how many times this bird went to a feeder on a particular day. And this map in particular shows us the data for a single bird, Joseph, on April 6th, 2019. But one of the most fascinating things we can do is watch how movement strategies change over time. This is that same map. I've just taken out the background for better clarity. So now let's watch what he does over the course of a month. At first, this bird seems to be doing quite a bit of moving around and exploring. But over time, it shifts to focusing on just one single feeder, repeatedly feeding throughout the day. This type of long-term insight into hummingbird behavior is still really quite rare. So from this data on movement and feeding, we found that male-like females do indeed have better access to food resources than their drab female counterparts. As I showed before, this is likely because they're receiving less aggression from other hummingbirds. So let's put these 4 observations together. Basically, you can think of this as avoiding bullies by pretending to be one. So imagine you're a hummingbird looking for food. And you come across 2 flowers, one guarded by a male and one guarded by a drab female. From previous experience, you know that trying to feed from this flower guarded by the male might risk a dangerous retaliation. So you're more likely to go towards this top flower and, if necessary, chase away that female. Now let's say there's a third choice with a male-like female. If you can't tell the difference between a male and a male-like female, you'll still avoid the male-like female to avoid retaliation, just like you did with that male. Therefore, these male-like females avoid getting bullied away from their food sources simply by pretending to be a bully, which ultimately gives them access to more food without actually having to be more aggressive. This type of phenomena is what we ended up calling intersexual social mimicry. And our discovery of this was one of the first times it had been shown in a bird. These results were pretty surprising, even to me. When I started my research, I thought this coloration had something to do with mating, which is the case in many colorful birds. But here I found that it actually had more to do with getting access to food. Okay, so variation is all really great and interesting, but you might be asking yourself, that's just one species, right? Can we really find something like this in other hummingbirds? I want to show you a figure from a paper that was just published last year. This is a female Anna's hummingbird, one of the most common hummingbird species in North America. And for the first time, someone documented that this nesting female has a complete male-like coloration on its face, with these brilliant pink gorget and head feathers. And to me, this really demonstrates how when you pay attention to diversity within species and within sexes, you really start to see some incredible things. Could this be another case of intersexual mimicry, like with the Jacobins, or is it something entirely different? We won't know that until someone investigates further. So this image shows the hummingbirds of North America, the males and the females, but also juveniles and different molt stages. As I mentioned before, there are really less than 20 species of hummingbirds that you can commonly find in North America. But those 20 species are actually a rich tapestry of biodiversity when you take into account the full extent of individual within species variation and diversity. This brings us back to my original question. Why do we pay attention to birds? And I think one of the biggest reasons I pay attention to birds is the opportunity to witness and contemplate that intricate detail. All of those differences that make each unique individual beyond the categories we assign them, like family, genus, species, or sex. Unlike many species, birds just seem to offer themselves to this kind of deep observation. They show themselves out in the open where we can watch them and listen to them, and I think that's truly a gift. And it reminds me of this very short poem by Mary Oliver. Instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. Now, as a final comment, I'll just mention that feeders are a fantastic way to pay attention and observe hummingbirds. I typically recommend one of these flat style feeders because they make a big red signal to the birds, and they're also much easier to clean. Feeders are easy. All you have to do is mix 1 part white sugar with 4 parts water and clean the feeder 2 times per week. I've also included this QR code to a nice Audubon website about attracting hummingbirds to your yard if you do have one. So with that, thank you all for listening today, and especially to the Library Speakers Consortium for the invitation. This is work that I've been doing for many years with many mentors, field assistants, mentees, and collaborators. And none of this would have been possible without them, as well as my funding sources, including the Smithsonian. And lastly, thank you to Panama for allowing me to do my research in this wonderful country and for conserving such rich lands that allow for the study of bird diversity in all forms. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay. What a wonderful and beautiful presentation. Thank you so much. Naturally, we have a lot of great questions that came in. We do have a lot of people, especially with your opening and your closing of why do I look at birds, wanting to know, other than scientifically, especially Cheryl from Harris County Library, why do you look at birds? So have you been interested in birds since childhood? How did you get into studying birds?
I would say I've been interested in looking at nature and especially animals ever since I was really, really little. I was the kid who was digging up worms and insects and I just wanted to like keep everything like in my hands or in a little cage and take care of them and raise them. And it was often my dad that would have to be like, no, it lives out there, you have to put it back. So that was me as a kid. My grandfather was the one who first introduced me to birding as a kid. And we used to go to this place, and I grew up in Austin, Texas, and we used to go to, it was actually a natural sewage plant where they were cleaning water, and the natural organic deterioration actually brought a lot of birds, especially water birds, to that area because of all the high nutrients and insects. So we would go there, and it was a little bit kind of like stinky to me, but like I go back there these days, and it still smells a little funky, but it's more nostalgic to me. Yeah, so that's why I began looking at birds. But later, as a PhD student, I really got into these birds because someone told me about this really cool thing about hummingbirds, and I decided that's the thing I had to study.
That's amazing. Hummingbirds are incredible. They're so beautiful. And we all love to see them in our yards. And Florence and William from Bucks County Free Library and a lot of other people were asking about kind of backyard behaviors. And Florence and William say, based on observation, there seemed to be a reduction in the number of backyard birds. Has this been scientifically verified, and what is it attached to? Are there any theories as to why this is occurring? Could it also be related to a considerable downturn in the number of butterflies even?
Yeah, so I am not aware of anyone that has shown a decrease in hummingbirds specifically, but definitely in birds. I forget the specific numbers, but I think there's a paper that came out just a few years ago showing just like a really incredible loss of numbers in birds over the last 50 years. Now that can be a number of things. A big one is the loss of insects. And people aren't quite sure why we've seen such drastic loss of insects, but insects are a really important food source for many birds, including hummingbirds. So people like to think of hummingbirds as just drinking nectar and from flowers, but they actually are voracious insectivores. And when they're chicks, they actually eat almost entirely insects and very little nectar. So that's one cause. Of course, climate change is an issue, but also for birds in general, outdoor cats can be a big problem.
Yeah, there were a lot of comments about cats and what do we do about them.
It's the eternal question. It's so hard. Yeah, it's a difficult one.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Celia from Northville District Library is saying, how do lawn chemicals and even leaf removal affect the bird populations? Because you even mentioned kind of like the insect population really dying down, which affects birds, which I would imagine those chemicals don't help.
Yeah, I think, you know, we often don't know the full extent of the effects of the chemicals that we're putting into the environment. And lawn chemicals and insecticides and herbicides are put into the environment in really like large quantities. And so, you know, but I think that probably the whole sort of point of a lot of lawn chemicals is deliberately to kill insects. And that's not only killing the insects that are, you know, eating the lawn or eating whatever you want to keep there. They're just killing everything large scale and like that could be important for birds. So there's been a big movement that I think it might be called like Kill Your Lawn or something. But it's a lot of people are these days are interested in ways that they can use that space of their lawn to, instead of it being kind of a way that like reduces biodiversity, but what ways can you take care of your lawn so that it actually increases? It can be like a safe haven for insects and for birds and butterflies and things like that.
Thank you. Kind of staying on the, I guess the destruction and like the threats posed to birds. Rochelle from Lennox Library is saying, in light of the rising threat posed by climate change, how might we expect shifts in avian behavior to eventually give rise to anatomical or evolutionary changes?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And I think it's going to be specific to whatever bird you're talking about. But one of the things that actually my postdoc advisor studies is the movement of genes northward in chickadees. And so one of the possible ways of adaptation within species to climate change is, so species are always to some extent kind of hybridizing at least just a little bit. And so there's always sort of genes crossing from closely related species. And what they're seeing is that there are a lot of genes from southern species of chickadees that are actually moving into the northern species. And one of the issues with that is that it seems to affect their caching ability. So, or caching is just like their ability to store nuts and seeds over the winter. I talked a little bit about it in the talk, but chickadees are sort of very well known for this. Like all season, they'll be obsessively keeping nuts in places that they need to remember for the winter when it's cold and there's less availability. But the movement of these genes seems to have that effect, have a negative effect on their ability to remember. And so right now we don't know whether or not that problem will persist. Likely there will be some sort of stabilization over time. But one of the things about climate change is we can't really, it's, you know, we used to call it global warming because we thought it was, you know, mostly global warming or warming in all cases. But what we're seeing now is that it really affects every place in different ways. In some cases, you're getting colder climates or more rainy climates. And so it's hard to say for any particular given species.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that the male-like females are an evolutionary they've evolved because of those aggressive factors. We did have a couple of questions about whether or not that affects that type of hummingbird's fertility. So let me find. So we had, I'm sorry, Margaret's question: how does being constantly attacked affect the drab female's fertility or raising their babies? And then the opposite of that is, do male-like females reproduce less?
Right. So as far as we know, there is no effect on fertility and parental care. But that's in terms of like the behavior of the females. But one thing I didn't talk about too much is I have found out a lot about the advantages to having that male-like ornamented plumage for the females. But there must be something that's keeping this in balance. So there must be some negative impact. And I haven't quite identified what that is, but we have strong suspicion that it has to do with predation. So again, like female hummingbirds are the only ones that take care of nests. Males don't do any parental care in hummingbirds. So having all that bright ornamented plumage, I think especially that bright white tail, is probably not good for you when you're sitting on the nest. And we know that in hummingbirds, predation is a really big problem for chicks. So in some species, it can be like 90% of the nests fail due to predation, which is a really intensely high number of nest failures. So I think just having that little tiny amount of noticeability might be at a disadvantage for those females. So I don't think it's necessarily fertility, but I think that, you know, maybe having that plumage might be a disadvantage for you when you're at the nest. But on the other hand, the advantage is that you're feeding more efficiently because you're getting attacked less at your food resources. So there may be this sort of trade-off between efficiently feeding your babies, but also being able to be invisible and unnoticed while you're taking care of your chicks.
Mm-hmm. That gets us kind of to the thought of coloration. And I guess even before that, Vivian is saying when females grow physical male typical traits, do they pass those coloration traits on to their babies, or will like how does that work?
Yeah, so this gets at my current research, and this is all very, very new. So it does appear to be a genetic trait in the females.
Okay.
Now, the interesting thing, though, is that it's not passed directly to the daughters of the females. It's actually passed through the sons, and then the sons pass it through to the granddaughters. And it's a little bit like, I don't know if you ever learned about like sex-linked traits like balding in human men. It's a little like I think it's like if your mother's father is balding, you're more likely to bald in your old age. So it's interesting. It's one of these things that's linked to your but in this case, it's female, so it's linked to your grandmother rather than to your mother.
Okay. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Lover of Birds is wondering, do the metal bands you're using in your studies cause the same issues that colorful bands once did in terms of mating?
So we don't use colored bands because mainly so this is one of the reasons it's so hard to study hummingbird behavior. Hummingbirds have very, very tiny feet. And while they're flying, they keep their feet just like right up against their chest, underneath all this like feathery fluff, so you just can't see them. And so we put these metal bands on them, which have a number on them. But we can't actually see those, and the other birds really can't see them either. They just have a little tiny number on them that, you know, once we catch them, if we do happen to catch them a second time, we can just look very carefully and move the feathers out of the way, and we can see that number. But it's a very small band.
And why would using a colored band affect mating?
So in some birds, it could affect mating, and I'm not really quite sure about what the question asker was referring to, if it was in a particular species, but it's true that birds often pay attention to color when they're choosing mates. Okay. So there's all sorts of evidence that, for example, in house finches, these birds that are common in urban areas and in cities, they're kind of brown, but then the males have this like smear of red on their face. And so they've found in house finches that females prefer males with more red on them. Mm-hmm. So they're clearly definitely paying attention to color. Whether or not they're paying attention to color on the feet, maybe not. There are certainly some birds like the blue-footed booby. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of those, but they're these goofy looking seabirds that have bright blue feet, and they kind of like waddle them during their courtship dance. They show their blue feet. So in that kind of case, I would imagine there are probably some effects of, putting other colorations on the legs of those birds. Mm-hmm. Other birds, like the hummingbirds, I wouldn't expect so, because you can't even really see the feet at all. First place.
Yeah. Is it safe to say that the hummingbird is your favorite bird, since that's what you've dedicated your research to? We had a lot of people ask about your favorite birds. So.
Yeah, okay. So there's something just so special about getting to know a species, in just getting to know a thing like in such detail. I think that, like if anyone, I think this is a case for any interest, like anything that you love, you just want to know all about it. And so definitely hummingbirds. I love hummingbirds. I'm very interested in them. And the white-necked jackman especially kind of just like feels part of my soul at this point.
Yeah.
But I would say if I had to like pick a non-hummingbird for my favorite bird, I would say it's the three-wattled bellbird. And yeah, look this bird up. They're incredibly fascinating. They have the loudest voices in the bird kingdom. And the three-wattled bellbird has these three little like fleshy bits that just kind of like hang down. And they go into the tops of the branches, and they just like fling these around and scream at each other. It's just really, really amazing to watch. It's spectacular.
That is amazing. So Anne from Timberland Regional Library says, what are the most important efforts currently being made in bird conservation, and how can the viewers also help with those efforts?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest efforts is education. And I think this goes back to a lot of what we were talking about at the beginning of the questions, these great questions about what are the things that are causing loss of birds. Mm-hmm. And we know that we see the biggest loss of diversity in birds in the insectivores, the birds that are eating insects. And I know a lot of people, talk about, like 20, 30 years ago, we would drive around on the countryside and your windshield would be splattered with insects, and that just doesn't happen anymore. So people have really noticed this loss of insects. And so I would say things like education about the effects of outdoor cats, that's a big thing. Education about the effects of lawn care, like someone brought up before, and just researching what you can do about bringing more, what you can do to not only not have a negative impact, but what you can do with your space to have a positive impact.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that's a lot of what I would like to see happen, at least.
That's great advice. Well, to close us out, Scott would like to know, what are your favorite bird behaviors to observe in the wild?
Oh my gosh, that is a great question. So I have to say, like, there's a particular kind of behavior that they call in the literature like complete body transformation. And you saw this in that Bird of Paradise video that I showed in the beginning of this presentation, where the bird just does not look like a bird at all. Looks like something totally different. You're like, what happened? How did they do that? How did they turn into that? And then they're just doing these like squishy head movements. It's like so strange and so beautiful all at the same time. But yeah, I think it's these, you know, I'll watch these like total body transformations like anytime, just like for hours.
So fascinating. Well, thank you so much. I know I learned so much today. I'm sure everyone else did too. So thank you for spending the hour with us and teaching us all something new.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for everyone for joining.
I want to echo that and extend a huge thank you to all of the audience members for joining our author talk today. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. Below the live stream video in the resources area, you can find a link to the book. So make sure you check that out. We look forward to everyone joining us on August 20th for an evening of romance and laughing when we chat with New York Times bestselling author Casey McQuiston. Be sure to register for this and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler, and thank you for joining us.